So what do you do when things don't necessarily go to plan?
I think the term they used was the bonfire of the Quangos. What it actually meant, all of a sudden, for thousands of people, this list of organisations will cease to exist within a number of months. It was really interesting that you have this sense of shame, really, to tell people.
And where do you go next?
In the organisation, people took their own view. So some people went, I'll just do the minimum I can.
Yeah.
Some people went, I'll do as little as I can, and I'll get out as soon as I can. But I just took the view, if you can stay positive and you can continue to do your job well, you don't know what opportunities come up.
Any sort of words of wisdom you'd give to people in a similar situation?
I don't know if I can give pearls of wisdom in my Black Country accent, but.
What does it take to set up a local authority trading company and lead it to success? In this episode of View from the Hill, I'm joined by Stu Buckley, Managing Director of Warwickshire Property and Development Group. Stu shares the journey that's brought him to this role, including the moments he's questioned whether he was good enough or ready for the challenge, and how he's grown from those experiences. He reflects on the leadership lessons learned along the way and the value of surrounding yourself with the right people. Stu's story offers insight, encouragement, and inspiration at every stage. Stu, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Helen.
Love to know a bit about you and your early life. How did you get into a career in the industry? And talk to me a bit about some of your early influences.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny one, really, because property was never a thing I was targeting doing. Growing up, it sort of friends or family members weren't in that sort of sphere, weren't in that area. And so for me, it was never anything sort of I'd looked at. But then as I was growing up, we used to get sort of a property supplement from the local paper. I thought, well, that's quite interesting. And then I went to uni and I did business studies. And I was the first one in the family to do that. So most of the family actually worked down the mines, worked down the pits. And my dad did, my uncles did, and so forth. So the idea of going into anything that wasn't sort of manual wasn't the first thing in my mind. I almost fell into it, really. I was just applying for jobs, and this job came up at what was called the Regional Development Agency at the time, back in 2001. And for me, it just looked interesting. It was sort of about property. It was sort of about economic regeneration. Didn't know what that term meant at the time, but I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I also applied for a job at Argus at the same time.
Keep your options open.
Yeah, keep my options open. So, sort of completely different roles. I went for the interview, and it was one of these, I'd never really wore a suit. The only time I'd ever wore a suit up to that point was going to a funeral or going to a wedding. And I'd walked in there and the office was buzzing. It was a big reception in the middle of Birmingham, big reception. I always remember Bernie was the receptionist. She was the most fantastic woman, and she was there at the very beginning when I started, and she was there at the end when we left. And she was really calming when you went in. She said, right, okay, you're here for an interview, sit down, and so forth. And for me, I spent the whole day there to do assessment centres, interviews, present on what I'd done in the past. Well, I was a graduate. The only job I'd ever had was working at Blockbuster Video Store. So, which, by the way, I absolutely loved. I love films, so that was a great job for me. So I had to do a presentation on that. And I was amazed that I went home, and about 2 hours later, I got a call saying, "You've got the job." And I always remember, because it was £16,000 the salary was at that time, and I thought, that's a lot of money. At Blockbusters, I'd probably been on, I don't know, 6 or 7, because it was part time while I was at uni, and I was like, okay, what do I do? And I went and spoke to my dad, and my dad said, well, 16 grand's better than 6. So,
it's a good starting point, isn't it?
Yeah. So yeah, get into that. And that was the first time where I'd noticed, for me, I was going into an area that I'd never understood. And so I think they call it imposter syndrome now, but
it's really interesting that you mention imposter syndrome, actually, because that's not the first time that's come up in our podcast series so far. So actually it's been quite a common theme. So interested to know a little bit more about the feeling of imposter syndrome and how you've experienced it, and any advice that you could give to people that are perhaps feeling it at the moment.
I think the thing is, it sounds really contrite, but to try and embrace it, try and think, actually, I am slightly sort of coming from a different lifestyle or a different area than perhaps some of my peers or things like that. So how can you bring that sort of uniqueness into who you are really and what you're trying to do? So for me, it was always, I'd always said, I'd started at relatively the bottom in the sense of the organisation when I first started at AWM. But actually, by doing that, I learned about everything, so don't know everything, but I learned a bit about everything. And so, just embrace the fact that, okay, if you don't know something, learn it, and get to understand it. And over time, you will get a level of confidence. But also don't be afraid that you might make mistakes. And that things might go wrong. And if the organisation is, I hate to say the word good organisation, but if the organisation recognises that its people, are there to progress something, and if a mistake happens, you deal with it, then actually that is what you want to work for. If you find an organisation just goes, well, actually, that was terrible, and you're out, or there's some, then actually, is that the organisation you really want to be in? Because everyone makes mistakes. I make mistakes even now, but it's learning from them. So don't be afraid of who you are or what, because often people's perception of you is different. That's the thing I've learned really, is that going into something, I'd always talk of myself as a lad from Cannock. But actually, as you grow into your career and grow into the activity you're doing, people look at you and as actually you do have that understanding. You do know what you're talking about. I value what you're saying. And you go, oh, okay, that's great. But so believe in yourself, but also people's perception of you is very different, really, to what you hardly think internally.
Absolutely.
Really.
And with imposter syndrome, it's not something people just experience on their way up in their career trajectory. It's something that you can feel on and off your whole life, right? It doesn't have to be a work-related feeling, but it's how you work through it. It's how you keep that positive attitude and learn from the things you're feeling, I suppose. Yeah,
definitely. I think it's whenever you walk in a room, really, you can go, do I feel like I fit in here? And it could be any type of event. It doesn't have to be work or anything else. And I think probably more people than not have that type of feeling, really.
Not everybody speaks about it, though.
But not everyone speaks about it.
Yeah, not everyone likes feeling that vulnerable, do they? To say
but I think, it's something that is prevalent in a lot of people. So for me, embrace it, build that confidence, know what you're talking about, and people will see a different view of you, really, than what perhaps you might have thought at the beginning. But going back to the point, that imposter syndrome, I don't think ever really leaves you because, for me, I didn't have, that background where, family in property, they know what it's all about. And you feel like, you've grown up with it. You've walked into a meeting, a boardroom, all that type of things. I remember my first time when I was at the RDA walking in to a room where you had to get an approval. So it was an approval group and sitting around the table was a collection of property professionals who all probably had 20 years experience. And I'm there to present a scheme. And you're like, okay, how's this going to go? And you do exactly what everyone does. The night before, you're reading all through it, you're making sure that you know all the bits and everything else. But then when you go in, there's always a question that gets asked that you just think, how am I going to answer that? I remember once I was doing what it was a bit late in my career, but the principle's the same. I remember once I got asked a question in this type of approval group saying, well, we're buying this site. There's a big employer in that area. They're expanding. How are we going to make sure they expand to support the site? I'm like, well, I can't give you that guarantee because it's down to them, and they're not part of this. But if they do, then obviously there's more jobs and more housing needed. So it's really sort of hard sometimes to think what are the questions that are going to be asked. And I think for me it's always preparing. You want to make sure that if you're going into anything, you can talk with some authority on the subject, really.
Absolutely. I'll come back onto that, if I may, in a little while, but just keen to know a bit about, so you were at the Regional Development Agency, or RDA as it's known, and, fast forward to 2011, RDA's ceased to exist, and you find yourself out of a role. So talk to us a bit about what you went through there and how you sort of pulled that back and carved out a different sort of career for yourself.
Yeah, it's one of these where, in life you're thinking it's going quite well, over the period from 2001 to that decade, really. I'd gained promotions in the job. So I went from a regen zone officer to development executive to development manager. And because of that, it gave you the security to go, and I bought a house, you were looking forward really in your life. I'd just met actually my wife in that year as well, in 2011. And so when you look at it, you go, it's great, life's great. You can see where it's going, free promotions, a bit more money in your back pocket, all that type of thing. And then all of a sudden, the incoming government made the decision that I think the term they used was the bonfire of the Quangos. It's a great term, but what it actually meant was for thousands of people, it was announced on the evening news. This list of organisations will cease to exist within a number of months. So no one got a heads up that it was a complete closure. I think people thought it was probably going to be, reduced down in scale and so forth. So that just hit everyone sort of like a shovel really at the back of the head. So everyone was in the same boat, and all of a sudden, everyone then had to think, what does that mean to them? And how do people react to that? And
where do you go next?
And where do you go next? And that was a quite interesting piece, was that, all of a sudden for me, it was like, well, I've got a mortgage. And then it was really funny because, as I say, I just met my wife at the time, and I went through this. I'm sure people have done similar, but you almost feel ashamed because you've got to say to them, I'm really sorry, but I'm going to be out of a job in like a few months. And you shouldn't feel ashamed because you didn't do anything to sort of bring it about as an individual, but you did. And she was great. And we actually were married in 12 months, but it was really interesting that you have this sense of foreboding and a shame really to tell people. But quickly, my view on life was things happen, things outside your control. It's an interesting one because, just as an aside, when I was younger, so I was adopted at 6 months. And so, for me, I always took the view from that really, that things just happen and you have to make the best of life. So I like to think I'm quite a positive person. So
you're very positive, Stu.
Yeah. So you go, okay, this has happened. And for me, the way I took it was, okay, I'm going to still do the best job I can. So, got sort of what deals across the line, if you want to call it that, close things down, all that type of thing. But it's interesting because in the organisation, it was sort of like people took their own view. So some people went, I'll just do the minimum I can because that's what I'm doing. Some people went, I'll do as little as I can, and then I'll be and I'll get out as soon as I can, and I can completely understand all three.
Jump ship almost.
Yeah. But I just took the view, I will look for jobs. So you look for jobs, you go for jobs, you don't get the job, and you're like, okay. But I still took the view that I will just keep motivating, doing what I'm doing. And in the end, when we got to sort of towards the end of the summer, I'd actually got the opportunity of trooping across, to two potential roles, and it was almost like that sliding door moment. It was like I could go more into the civil service and do European funding, or I could go across to what was then called the Homes and Communities Agency and carry on the property sort of role. And for me, after a bit of deliberation and conversation, I decided to do that. But life is like that, isn't it? It's like you get to a point, it's like
a crossroads moment, isn't
crossroads,
it?
yeah.
And I think incredibly pertinent at the moment with, all the conversations about local government reorganisation, LGR, and people feeling exactly how you might have felt, those years ago of not knowing what's coming, a slightly longer timeline than you perhaps experienced, but people not knowing where they stand with their careers, etc. So what would your advice be to people that are in in a similar situation to yours or in this LGR context to stay resilient and strong, I guess?
I mean, for me, I think it is a really sort of upsetting time, really, to that uncertainty. I think it's almost perhaps just thinking about what you want rather than be reactionary and go, I'll take the first job that comes up and I'll get out, or I'll do the minimum I can. And for me, I think it's almost, because if you can stay positive and you can continue to do your job well, you don't know what opportunities come up. But if you close it in, then all of a sudden it's like, well, if people have got to go, then you'll be first to go, or things like that. So I think it's continuing to sort of do your job, do it well, look for opportunities, and also just sort of take stock of what do you want to do with your life. I mean, it's amazing that when this comes up, some people find a career that they never knew they wanted. I remember when the RDAs were closing down, one of the chaps, he went and became a school teacher. And he absolutely loved it. And he I think he's retired now, but he did it for 10 years or more after that. And you wouldn't have thought that until he sat down and thought, what do I want?
So it could trigger a career change.
Or
it could build on, into something much bigger.
But I think, LGR, just in terms of, I think presents challenges, as you've said. It also presents opportunities as well, particularly for sort of organisations like us and LATCOs. For some, it can be, where do we fit? Because if there's multiple LATCOs in a new area, how do they work? How do they, do they combine? What happens? I think from the point of view, if you're creating sort of larger, more financially stronger organisations with a bigger land bank, then actually what we do at WPDG and others do at Treveth and Gorham and places like that, there's a real opportunity to upscale that.
Definitely.
And I think that's where, the new organisations can really try and return some added value, really, both financial and sort of objectives of delivering more houses and floor space and stuff like that. Really.
And I think it's looking at it as that real opportunity, like you say, to scale up. It's, who knows what might happen in the next couple of years, but there's such a great opportunity here. And I think seeing your positivity around the art of the possible is really encouraging. But if we can just rewind and go back to the sort of the setting up of WPDG, just pulling it back to personal perspectives from a leadership angle, setting up a brand new LATCO, setting up new joint ventures, having that key relationship with the council as the total shareholder. What are some of the leadership lessons that you've learned along the way? And is there any sort of words of wisdom you'd give to people in a similar situation?
Words of wisdom, that's in it.
Pearls of wisdom.
Yeah, pearls of wisdom. I don't know if I can give pearls of wisdom in my Black Country accent, but I think what I would say is just important to remember that it's all about partnership and people. That, for me, that's the biggest thing. You're dealing with very big organisations, whether that's, the council, whether that's Vistry, whether that's some of our smaller contractors, you're dealing with people and partnerships. So they're going to have red lines. The council wants certain things, Vistry wants certain things. We're almost a bridge in that, so we're looking both ways all the time. For us to deliver, we've got to make sure the council are happy on one side, that the viability works, and that Vistry or Seddons or Gida, whoever our partners are, can do that and can do it at a cost that works for everyone. And we've got to keep an eye on, but we're selling them, or Vistry are selling them, or so how do we do that, really? So for me, it is about partnership and making, my role is looking both ways and trying to make sure that everyone's getting, that compromise solution, because you're not going to get everything you want, but it's making sure you can get that compromise solution. So, if people are looking at, for me, leadership isn't about just leading from the top. I think 90% of the role I do is almost middle management, because you're working with both sides of the fence to try and make sure that everything's going forwards, and that everyone's content to allow these things to happen.
So what do you do when things don't necessarily go to plan. I mean, it all sounds like it's moved, in a really good direction. But I'm sure there've been some setbacks along the way. And with you as managing director, what have you experienced, and how do you sort of keep pushing through?
I mean, we've been quite lucky in that we've had, again, we'll talk about team. The strongest asset we've got is the team. We've had a really good team of people, and we've been quite lucky that majority of people we've brought in, have really grown into the role and been able to take it forward. Where the challenges are, is the day to day of the reactions, because property isn't fixed. So the biggest thing about property is it's constantly moving. So that could be, you find something on a site, archaeology becomes a bigger issue, and that becomes tens of thousands or £100,000 issue. You find that, at the minute, the residential market is really challenging from a sales point of view, but equally build costs are still going up.
Exactly.
External influences, wars or things like that have an effect on material costs, have an effect on access, labour.
Yeah.
So we're not immune to that. We have and we continue to have some challenging conversations around, build costs and sales values, and we don't hide that from the partners or the councils, because that's what property is. So, we've always said we will be, completely open, and if things happen, we will inform the council or we'll work with the partners to find a solution. Now, sometimes that involves a bit of pain on everyone, but we have to approach it by the fact that you've got to be moving forward. So there's no point of sitting on an issue and going, it'll disappear. Yeah. You've got to deal with it. And for me,
being transparent.
Yeah, and working the problem. If we have, as I'm sure a lot of contractors do and developers do, projects coming over budget. So you work really hard to get the budget down and back onto a number that can work. And most of the times that works, sometimes that doesn't, and you have to look at other alternative approaches, really. But it's having that grown-up conversation with the partners in that sense.
And I guess managing expectations as well, as to, like you say, it's a very fluid sector, and things change. Things can really advance quickly. Others can, developments can stall. It's about, I suppose, having those, like you say, adult conversations really, and keeping things open. I was at the LATCO conference last week in Birmingham. There were loads of people there in similar positions to yours, or perhaps on boards of LATCOs, etc. And there was still some talk of, even though LGR is approaching, there's still talks of the need and the benefits of setting up and running LATCOs and the commercial value, etc. So again, from a leadership angle, what kind of advice would you give to anybody coming into a brand new LATCO, or perhaps looking to grow or scale up a LATCO? What kind of advice might you give?
I mean, I think there's a clear benefit in doing it for the local authority. So if a local authority, is looking to set one up and asking the question why, what I would say is, it allows you to get more value out of your portfolio. So, for instance, you could, have a site, get planning on it, or get it allocated and just sell it. And you'll find people who want to buy that. And then you've got a capital receipt and you can reinvest that. What we've tried to do, and I say it's a foresight with the council, is actually, the joint venture, for instance, the council get the land value, so that has to be independently assessed and so forth. So the council get the land value as in any other transaction, so they get a capital receipt. That though goes in as loan notes, and Vistry have to match that for the cash to deliver the scheme, the working capital. So both Vistry and the council get interest on those loan notes. So the council get the land value plus interest, because it doesn't materialise for, say, 3 years. And then the council at the end, everyone, so the ownership is us, the council and Vistry, sharing the profit. So it's 3 bites of the cherry in that sense. So, and also it gives an ability for the council to have a level of control in that, and us to have a level of control. So, for instance, the homes we're building through the joint venture are EPCA. So that means lower running costs for residents in the county. So that's a benefit. But what also it meant was we set out for the joint venture at the very early stages, it needed to put this 2-kilometre link road in at Top Farm and all the associated infrastructure. But what that did, it unlocked £35 million to the DFE to build the secondary school.
Oh, right.
So at Top Farm, whilst from June 24 to September last year, Vistry and the team and the council and us, worked together so that we got all the infrastructure in, 2 kilometres link road, all the power and utilities and all that type of thing. That opened up the ability to get the first 50 units finished in September. But what it did, it gave the confidence to the DFE, because the DFE was saying, we've only got so much cash and there's other schemes around the country. It gave the confidence to them to say, we'll start. So they actually started a few months before we did, because they knew it was going to happen. And the school was open in September on time. So that area now has got the secondary school it needs to support the housing growth. And we've got the first, hundreds of probably 200 units up now. And so the area is becoming a place.
Yeah.
And the one thing we can do, because what happens sometimes is the other facilities like the local centre with your shop and your coffee shop and all those type of things, they sometimes come forward much later,
right?
Because housing developers don't normally deliver them; they find another partner. But what we're doing is we as WPDG are delivering that local centre. So planning will go in for the local centre at Top Farm in the next few months, and hopefully by the end of next year, that area has got a secondary school, hundreds of homes, the first POS areas, plus a convenience store, hopefully a coffee shop and a few other things. So people can go, actually, I can drop I can walk the kids to school, I can get a pint of milk, I can have a coffee, and it's a place rather than just it's dormitory. I have to drive everywhere, the school, the kids have to catch a bus and, the school's, a good walk away. So that's what we're trying to do, is bring about a place, not just sort of, just homes, and you say, people have to drive everywhere. So how much of your role or how much of your time is spent engaging directly with communities to sort of engage and see what they want from their local place? So we do a lot on sort of public consultations and so forth. We've just finished one about a local centre in Warwick, and for us, we want to tailor the developments to what people need. Now, it still needs to be viable, but as an example, one of the areas we work in is creating small-scale commercial industrial units, because what we found is we did a bit of work and working with the councils and with the investment team as well, where in Warwickshire, I think this is probably the same across the country, a lot of developers build big sheds, industrial units, 50,000 square foot, up to 1 million, 2 million, that type of thing. But not many build the smaller units for SMEs. So our first scheme that we did outside the joint venture was a small, we said to the council, as an option, we can build one single building of 50 to 60,000 square foot, and we can let it to one person, one organisation, and you'll probably make more money off that. Or we said, for the benefit of the county, we could build a multi-unit scheme, which has got 9 industrial units, so you can have up to 9 occupiers, right, and so forth. And actually the council said, yes, do that. And now we've completed that sort of probably 18 months ago. It's fully let now. We've got, 6 businesses in there. One of the business was a startup. Well, we've got 2 startups, but one of them was a startup that's gone from sort of a man with an idea, or 2 men with an idea, to employing now 10 people, to now looking at, actually, we might want to take on another unit elsewhere, and up to 45 people. So that's the benefit of what we can do.
Shows the impact on the local economy, doesn't it? The fact you're helping to boost it and give people space to invest and to grow their own businesses. And hopefully then, people aren't driving out of the place to go and look for work in other nearby towns or cities. You're growing that all in the county,
exactly,
aren't you?
And the county have really latched onto this. So we've got another scheme which starts on site in Warwick in the next couple of weeks. We've got another one going in for planning in Rugby. So all of a sudden, we're building a portfolio of these, and we're probably over the next 5 years going to create probably about 60 of these units. And all of that will be to support that sort of local SME economy. But actually, I know I haven't got the stats in front of me, but something like 80% of people work in SME businesses. So that's, that's fantastic, because it's growing the GVA of the region, because other people are building the sheds for, your big companies and your Rolls Royces or whatever. What we're trying to do is sort of grow that SME sector really in Warwickshire.
Just goes to show, doesn't it, in local government and in LATCOs, how much of an impact you can make on so many people and so many different places. It's incredible. I want to come on to next a bit of a question we ask all of our guests, really. We call it our golden thread question. So at Tile Hill, we've got an internal motto, an EVP, if you will, that we love the impact we make. So that's something we're really proud of. We tell each other internally and others that we can physically see the difference that we're making to people's jobs and careers, etc. So with that in mind, we'd love to know a bit about your proudest moment, I suppose. What's the biggest impact, or smallest, but the one that stood out the most to you and that you're most proud of?
I think for me, it's seeing the difference that you make working in sort of the sector, the public, quasi-public sector, in the sense that, the amount of jobs that are created on schemes that you've delivered, the amount of people that you see moving into their house, but because actually that's what the job's about. It's about making a difference to people's lives. And that's what I love more than anything else. I mean, I was just talking about Green Tech, the company that's expanding, and that is fantastic because, you can see them taking on young people who've never had a job. Yeah. And now that, they've got the first job. I always remember doing a scheme in Warsaw. And again, we built cinema and restaurants and things like that. And some of these people had never had a job, and they were sort of in their mid-20s and not for want of trying, but just hadn't happened. And just seeing them get into that, for me, that's the best thing of the job, is seeing it changes people's lives. And I mean, the other thing that is, I suppose, is an interesting one, is, again, sort of just for the listeners, is always when you're starting out, you always look and go, I'm joining this organisation and there's a chief executive there, and you're probably 5, 6, 7 layers away from that person, and you think, wow, that person's important and they do all this and everything else. But actually, the really funny thing for me is I've almost gone full circle, because our chair, who joined sort of just over 12 months ago, was actually the chief exec of Advantage West Midlands, a regional development agency.
Oh, so you worked together before?
So for me, but I was sort of like 4 or 5 runs down. But it is interesting to think, when you're starting out in your career, don't be scared of that fact that, if that's, you will move up through your career. You're never always going to be, when I joined, I thought, I've got this job and that's great. And it's like, that's where you're going to be. And then over time you move up a little bit and so forth. But I never thought when I started out, I'd be doing what I'm doing now. And I think it's just thinking about that, those people who you think are, at that level, and you might never really interact with them. And then 20 years later, you find, every week you're having, conversations with them, and that, and they're all, it's that mentoring. I think it's looking for people. I think for me, throughout my career, I've been really lucky. I've worked with some really good people, and they've helped me along the way. Sometimes without them even realizing, when I was at the HCA, there was a chap there, David, and he really instilled in me how to write reports. And I thought at the time, well, he's just going back over it. But actually, I've used that going forward, and that's really valuable. And then others have just been a guiding light in sort of your career and how you move forwards.
Well, it goes. I was just thinking back to the first name you mentioned was Bernie on reception when you walked into that first job interview. The way she made you feel, and that calming presence, to the person that helped you write the report. So I think it's amazing that you look back and reflect and remember the people that made that a small or slightly bigger difference, and you've carried that, and hopefully you're then giving that back to people that you're, I don't know if you're coaching anyone or mentoring, or informally or formally, but the change is coming up in the sector, and actually we do a lot of research to do almost sort of test to see how people are feeling, the mood music in the sector. We did one last year, we did a bit of a survey, we're doing it again this year, and people are still feeling really uncertain. There's a good cohort of people that are really excited by the change, but not everybody does like change, and some people are quite panicked or unsettled by it. So to hear your story and your journey of, your earlier career going through a redundancy, which must have been, really hard at the time, to where you've got to now, it's really encouraging. So thanks for sharing your
thank you.
There.
Thank you for the time, and hopefully the listeners can take something from that.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
At Tile Hill, we work with leaders like Stu, the very people who are shaping the future of the public sector. We're passionate about connecting talented people with organisations that make a real difference. So if you're a leader looking for your next opportunity, or an organisation looking for support in finding the right people, we'd love to hear from you. You can find out more about us at tile-hill.co.uk or connect with us on LinkedIn to see how we can help to support you in your career. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.